think I mentioned that next up is elasticity, a new idea, a new tool in our toolkit here. But before we get there, I want to talk a little bit about property rights. And rules, right? The rules governing access to and control over resources. All of economics in 4 points, number 4. So markets, as we are learning here in this day and age, and as I emphasized early on, markets are mechanisms for generating information and discovering information. So we could talk about efficiency, and the question would be, how do we know what is efficient? How do we know whether resources should be used to create cars or ventilators? How do we know whether masks should go to Facebook founders or to healthcare professionals? Now, some of those you might say, well, obviously we know this, but the question is, we're always making trade-offs on the margin. Should one more or one less end up over here? And it turns out that markets are an excellent way to discover and to generate this information. Turns out without them, oftentimes we don't have recourse to figuring out where things should go and what is actually efficient. Of course, in order for markets to work effectively, to communicate information and to provide incentives to act on that information, hopefully you're sensing a theme. That's something we keep coming back to. Social coordination occurs because of the interaction of individuals who are choosing according to their expected marginal benefit and their expected marginal cost. What we care about is social coordination. What we care about is maximizing human flourishing. But we have to figure out what would cause us to maximize human flourishing. And one way to do that, the way we've been talking about most of this semester, is using markets, right? As we talked about, there's a number of ways to ration resources to determine who gets what. Right now we're into a phase where, we're actually rationing based on either first come, first serve at grocery stores, or possibly rationing, right, a certain number of items per individual. That's another way to do it, and we're going into that phase. Whether that's a good thing or not is another question. We actually have some tools to look at that. Remember, rationing based on willingness to pay is not the only way of rationing things. And rationing based on willingness to pay sometimes creates issues when there's a divergence between willingness and ability. Right? So, markets as a discovery mechanism. But in order for markets to work well, to communicate that information and provide incentives to act on that information, we need some rules in place. And the rules matter a great deal. So markets are great discovery mechanisms when we get the rules right. When we get the rules wrong, they can be a terribly destructive thing. Turns out that property rights, certain structures of rights, private property rights particularly, generate opportunities for mutually beneficial exchange. What we've been talking about, trade creating value. Again, there are two human tendencies, the tendency to truck, barter, and exchange, cooperate, what we've been talking about most of the time, and also the tendency to rape, pillage, and plunder. Sorry, muting this here, do not disturb, right? So the tendency to rape, pillage, and plunder can also be unleashed, as we've seen with people mobbing grocery stores, and I haven't seen too many stories of people knocking each other down, but again, different rules can release different tendencies. If we get the rights correct, if we get the property rights, if we get the rules right, we can end up with beneficial exchange. Now, it turns out that arguments over efficiency are usually, or arguments over the appropriate use of resources, are almost always actually arguments over property rights. It turns out with clear property rights, an owner's decision can be overridden by somebody else. If you don't like the way somebody's using a resource, you can bid them away from those people, right? Again, how do we communicate this information? We have prices. Prices mean that whether I want to or not, I have to take into account somebody else's desire to use the item. So if you think about what's going on, I can give up the opportunity to collect. So I have a bunch of board games, right? And I can say, I own these. I have a property right to these. I can say, so somebody else wants my copy of Artemis Project. Screw them, right? I can do that. The key, however, is that when I do that, the amount they would be willing to pay me actually shows up over here. By not selling my copy of Artemis Project, I'm giving up the opportunity to collect that revenue from them, that payment from them, which means that their willingness to pay is now a cost to me. Of course, right? So then I would have the benefit of that I get out of it versus the benefit that they get out of it. And in that case, with clear and stable property rights, when that is the case, when they get more value out of it than I do, what's going to happen? Arguably, I'm going to almost certainly, except in cases where there's high transaction costs, I'm going to sell it to them. Right? On the other hand, when I get more value out of it than they get, I'm going to hold on to it. We don't necessarily know, with a system of property rights, we're not entirely sure which direction things are going to go, any more than we're sure when we have issues of sunk cost. It doesn't tell us exactly what's going to happen. But it does mean that the benefit that other people would get out of resources are taken into account by people. They become a cost. So hopefully that makes sense. This is part of why I really like markets, is, in theory, assuming transaction costs are relatively low, and I think in practice, when transaction costs are relatively low, when there aren't things getting in the way, we're typically going to get resources going to higher valued uses. Maybe we could use an example of this. So, talk a little bit here about the Rainey Wildlife Preserve. Some of you may have heard of the Audubon Society. The Audubon Society, named after a wildlife painter, Audubon, I think, they're set up to protect wetlands and birds. So, how do you think the Audubon Society, it's a private voluntary organization that takes donations and uses those donations to either try and affect public policy or alternately to maybe buy land and then protect wildlife on it, particularly wetland birds. So how do you think the Audubon Society feels about oil drilling on public lands? My guess is you've figured out they're probably not big fans of it. Generally, particularly in wetlands, right? Why? Because oil drilling, there's a risk of spills, and it makes noise, and it disrupts migratory nesting patterns, etc. Right? So the Audubon Society has almost always been against oil drilling. Now, this fellow Rainey ended up giving the Audubon Society a huge amount of land. Turned out, now this is wetland area, turned out that this land had a lot of oil underneath it. And of course, what did the Audubon Society do? They said, we won't drill here. Well, somebody else came along and said, yeah, okay, I know you don't want to drill, but here's the deal. We'll give you a lot of money. Right? Now, is the Audubon Society driven by money? Not particularly. They're arguably concerned with the preservation of wildlife and wetlands. So, what did they do? After these people came and gave them a lot of money, they had a long searching of the soul. Audubon Society is clearly against drilling on wetlands. However, they said, you know what? Let's go ahead and do this. And they permitted the drilling on this preserve. Now, they've subsequently stopped it. The backlash was too much. But they did put extra protections on. They insisted on not drilling at certain times of the year. They insisted on greater safety precautions. And as a result, the people who were drilling for oil ended up paying them less. Now, what did the Audubon Society do with that money? They didn't go throw wild parties or go to strip clubs. What they did was they bought more land that was conducive to wildlife. Now, What was the difference between the Audubon Society's position generally, versus their position on the Rainey Wildlife Preserve? Well, let's think about this from the point of view of what happens. They, again, as ever, are going to choose according to their expected marginal benefit and their expected marginal cost. On public land, what's the benefit they get out of drilling? Really, they don't get anything out of the drilling. They don't get any money out of it. They don't get to take money and go buy other land. They don't get any benefit. What's the cost to them of drilling on public land? Right? Birds, bird habitat, possible disruption, there's other things, right? Now, when we go to private property, this doesn't mean, by the way, that they're going to permit drilling. As we've seen, as I mentioned, they've subsequently stopped. Basically, they ended up deciding that the benefit was less than the cost. The key is once we go from the government owning the land, in other words, nobody really owning the land, communal ownership, to private ownership. Once they got this grant, what happened? Instead of the benefit of drilling being zero, the benefit is the money they get paid. And the money they get paid represents the value other people place on getting that oil out of the ground and into circulation. In other words, when this was collectively held, they didn't take into account the preferences of other people in society. Once it was privately held and they bore the costs and got the benefits of the choice. So this is one of the other things you might think about here. If we want to think about social coordination and maximizing human flourishing, we would almost certainly want the people who make the decisions to get the benefits and to bear the costs. When that happens, we're going to get social coordination. We're going to get resources in efficient use. And basically, this here, again, the value that they get, we don't know what's going to happen. Again, as I mentioned, they've permitted drilling for a while, then they stopped permitting drilling, right? But when they don't own this, they clearly can just say to everybody else in society, I don't care about your preferences. I don't care what you want, because it doesn't enter into my decision-making function. And this is much more widespread in society. You could think about in lots of situations, as I mentioned, right? Why are textbooks so expensive? Because faculty make a decision based on their expected marginal benefit and expected marginal cost. If we gave, it's a little hard to think about, there are some situations where we can't really work out a property rights solution here. However, one of the keys is that environmental questions and questions about efficiency are actually generally arguments over who gets to make decisions. So you hear discussions about public lands in this state. I saw an ad on YouTube the other day about something about, we have great elk and the elk are on public lands, and this congressman or senator or state legislator is against, is in favor of selling off these lands. Terrible thing. Well, what's really happening there? If they sold off, say we sold off all of the federal land, if the value of that land was highest as national parks, as wildlife preserves, etc., what do you think would happen? I would argue that assuming if we have sufficiently low transaction costs, what's going to happen is we're going to end up with that land being in private hands and in the use of wildlife preserves or parks. Not necessarily, it's not that people are going to suddenly farm that land unless that land is more valuable in farming. So it turns out most of these arguments are about who gets to make the decision, and also who pays, right? So people enjoy, again, we'll get into more environmental economics here before too long, but this is, again, that point that rules matter. If you think about efficiency questions, there's the question of who decides. Who decides whether that land should be used for logging Or for hiking, who decides whether it should be used for snowmobiling or hunting? What's the optimal mix there? That's a really tough question. How do we know that? Turns out people have different values on things. And the issue is, of course, if you ask somebody, how much do you value hunting? Versus how much does this other person value snowmobiling? As I mentioned, prices are generated, and the information contained in prices are generated, not revealed in the process of exchange. And so absent exchange, it turns out most of us don't know this. However, when you are actually faced with a decision as to, is it worth $200 to go hunting on this land? Is it worth $700 to go snowmobile? You're going to figure out pretty quickly. You won't know for sure, but you're going to know that you value this land at least this much or not this much. You're not going to know for sure, but you're going to have some information. When we don't use markets to allocate these resources, then we all have an incentive not just to lie, but we actually aren't going to know where the value we're placing is highest, right? And so a lot of these discussions about public lands or what we should do with public lands, one of them would be, I should be able to decide for everybody else. Now, again, I think that's kind of hard to defend. I actually see most of that discussion about public land being that I want society to subsidize my preferences. And I get that. We all do. We would all like our preferences to be subsidized. But I think most of us understand that that's not a viable way of organizing a society. Maybe I want to go see Galaxy's Edge at Disneyland. And I look at the prices and I look at the hotels nearby and I go, holy crap, that's a lot of money. Right? I haven't looked at them, but I should. I could reasonably do that. And then, of course, what do I say? I mean, I haven't been to Disneyland or Galaxy's Edge, period. I mean, I went when I was a kid, but I haven't been in the last 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, really. No, 30 years, right? Why? Because arguably I'm saying the benefit of going to Galaxy's Edge is less than the cost. Now, we could say, right? People look at that and they say, oh, look, that's crazy expensive. And let's think about all the benefit kids and grown-ups and grown kids and all this stuff would get out of going to Galaxy's Edge. We say, oh, look, the benefit is really big. So we should clearly have government programs to subsidize people going to Galaxy's Edge. Or we should make this a national, right? Shouldn't we make Disneyland a national park? It gets us a lot of benefit. Again, I think most of us go, well, that would be silly, and the park might not actually be very good if it was run by the Bureau of the Interior, but also but there's certain areas where we say, obviously, we're going to use markets, but there's others where we say, obviously, we should use government. We're going to need to build an additional toolkit to talk about when it makes analytic sense to use government. But right now, I could end this section. I just wanted to kind of plant a seed here that who makes decisions is really the key, and who pays is really most arguments about efficiency and about optimal allocation of resources, particularly when it comes to government programs, are actually arguments over who gets a subsidy. If we wanted to figure out the optimal allocation of resources, if we were really serious about having an efficient system, and again, assuming transaction costs are sufficiently low, what we would do is privatize everything. Not because we love corporations, but because when private individuals own things, suddenly the value that other people place on that item gets factored in. I have to take that into account. Other people's valuation of any of my board games, other people's valuations of my Triumph motorcycle. I still own my Triumph motorcycle, which tells us that the benefit I'm getting out of it is higher than the benefit that other people would be getting out of it. Now, if somebody came up to me and said, I'll pay you $25,000 for your Triumph motorcycle, I'd say, holy crap, now I just discovered and got some information that this would be more valuable in other hands. But the fact that people, right, if somebody comes up and says, I'll give you $1,200 for it, I say, screw you, right? What does that screw you actually tell us? That screw you tells us that the benefit I'm getting out of the Triumph is greater than the benefit the other person would get. Now again, in the midst of all of our supply and demand, and as we move on here to get more specific and zoom in about elasticity, I don't want you to lose track of the bigger emphasis here. The bigger emphasis, which is we want to maximize human flourishing and social coordination. And one of the things we have to overcome, obviously, is the information problem and the incentive problems. The information and incentive problems. And unless we have a good reason to think that the markets aren't going to work, that private property isn't going to work, we probably should have that as our default. Now again, in this time, maybe we have some idea that people are irrational. I just read an article this morning about a couple in Canada who went to the grocery store. They're getting death threats after panic buying. They went to the grocery store and bought all of the meat. They checked out of the grocery store with 2 shopping carts full of meat. And not only did they do that, they then posted their purchase on social media, and now they're very puzzled as to why people are upset with them, right? So that could be a case where, now, I think part of the issue as to why that happened was there was some restraint on prices. If prices were fluctuating fully, and if we understood this and we said, look, we should just increase the price until the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded, I think we wouldn't have had this issue. They would have looked at the price and gone, oh wow, you know what? I should leave some of this on the shelves. Not because I necessarily care about the other people, but because I'm receiving information and being provided with the incentives to act on this information. Now, there may be times when we want to move away from prices and property rights and then profit. We're going to have to talk about profit before too long. But again, unless we have an alternative way in which we are going to overcome the information and the incentive problems, we're going to want to be pretty careful. Again, planting the seed here. In macroeconomics, we are digging in and getting more specific about this whole set of rules. It's a very rich network of things. But I just wanted to plant the seed here that rules matter and that efficiency is really about who gets to make the decisions.